In the gilded halls of Ravenscroft Palace, where secrets echo louder than footsteps, a single tear from a king can shatter more than just his own heart. When Guard Captain Marcus witnessed His Royal Majesty King Alexander collapse in anguish before a portrait that should have brought comfort, he realized that some wounds never heal. They only learn to hide behind crowns.
The morning mist clung to Ravenscroft Palace like a shroud, and Guard Captain Marcus Thornfield had learned to read the weather as an omen. 23 years of service had taught him that storms often began not in the sky, but within the stone walls he protected.
Today felt different, heavier somehow, as if the very air carried the weight of unspoken grief. King Alexander had been different since Queen Isabella's return from her diplomatic mission to the Northern Territories. The servants whispered in corners, their voices carrying fragments of concern that Marcus pretended not to hear. But a guard captain's duty extended beyond protecting physical walls. Sometimes it meant protecting the silence that held a kingdom together. The portrait gallery had always been Alexander's sanctuary. Marcus remembered when the king would walk those halls as a young prince, stopping before each painting to listen as his father, the late King Edward, recounted tales of their ancestors. The gallery held generations of royal history, but one portrait commanded attention above all others, the magnificent painting of Queen Ilara, Alexander's beloved first wife, who had died in a tragic riding accident 7 years prior. Marcus had been on duty that terrible autumn morning when the news arrived. He watched a vibrant young king transform into a hollow shell of grief, saw how Alexander's shoulders seemed to carry invisible chains from that day forward. The kingdom mourned their beloved queen, but Alexander's mourning was a private torment that never truly ended. Queen Isabella had been chosen for Alexander through careful diplomatic negotiation, a marriage of necessity rather than love, designed to strengthen alliances and secure the kingdom's borders. She was beautiful, intelligent, and kind, everything a queen should be. Yet Marcus had observed the careful distance between the royal couple, the polite formality that replaced the passionate devotion Alexander had shared with Ilara. On this particular morning, Marcus was conducting his routine security rounds when he heard something that made his blood freeze. The sound of a grown man weeping. Not just any man, but his king, the sovereign he had sworn to protect and serve. The sound echoed from the portrait gallery, raw and heartbroken, cutting through the palace's usual morning calm like a blade. Marcus approached the gallery with careful steps, his training warring with his concern. Protocol dictated that he should withdraw, allow the king his private moment. But something in those sobs spoke of a deeper crisis, a breaking point that might require intervention. As he reached the gallery's ornate entrance, Marcus positioned himself where he could observe while remaining hidden behind one of the marble columns that lined the hallway. What he witnessed would haunt him for the remainder of his days. King Alexander stood before Queen Ilara's portrait, his usually composed figure crumpled with grief. His royal robes hung loosely on his frame, and his crown sat askew on his dark hair. But it wasn't just the sight of his king in distress that shocked Marcus. It was the presence of Queen Isabella, who stood in the gallery's opposite end, watching her husband's emotional breakdown with an expression Marcus couldn't quite decipher. The Queen had returned from her month-long diplomatic mission only 3 days prior, and her homecoming had been celebrated with the usual pageantry and formal ceremonies. But Marcus had noticed the subtle tension in the royal household, the way conversations stopped when either monarch entered a room, the careful scheduling that seemed designed to keep them apart. She would have known what to say, Alexander whispered to the portrait, his voice cracking with emotion. Ilara always knew how to ease the burden. She understood the weight of the crown without needing explanation. Marcus felt like an intruder witnessing this intimate confession, yet he couldn't tear himself away. The king's pain was palpable, filling the gallery like a living thing. Alexander reached toward the portrait with trembling fingers, stopping just short of touching the painted surface. I've tried to honor her memory while fulfilling my duty to the kingdom, Alexander continued, his words becoming more strained. But I feel like I'm failing everyone, her spirit, Isabella's patience, our people's expectations. How do you rule with a broken heart? How do you give love when yours was buried 7 years ago? From her position across the gallery, Queen Isabella moved slightly, and Marcus saw her profile clearly for the first time. Tears streamed down her face as she listened to her husband's confession. Not tears of anger or jealousy, but of understanding and shared sorrow. Marcus realized that Isabella had been carrying her own burden, loving a man whose heart belonged to a ghost. The scene that unfolded next revealed the true complexity of the royal situation. Alexander, still unaware of his wife's presence, sank to his knees before the portrait, his composed facade completely shattered. The mighty king who commanded armies and governed a nation was reduced to a grieving widower, lost in memories of happiness that seemed like another lifetime. "I don't know how to move forward," Alexander confessed to the painting. "Isabella deserves better than a husband who can only offer duty and respect. She's been nothing but gracious and understanding, but I see the loneliness in her eyes. I'm failing as a king and as a husband." It was then that Queen Isabella chose to reveal herself, stepping forward from the shadows with quiet grace. Her movement caused Alexander to look up sharply, his face flushing with embarrassment and surprise at being discovered in such a vulnerable state. "Your Majesty," Isabella said softly, using the formal address despite their intimate setting. "Perhaps it's time we spoke honestly about our situation." Alexander scrambled to his feet, attempting to restore his dignified bearing. But the emotional toll was evident in his shaking hands and red-rimmed eyes. Marcus found himself holding his breath, sensing that this conversation would determine the future of not just the royal marriage, but the stability of the entire kingdom. "Isabella, I didn't realize. I thought you were in the East Wing reviewing trade documents," Alexander stammered, clearly mortified that his private grief had been witnessed. "I was," Isabella replied, moving closer with measured steps. "But I've been thinking during my time away, and I believe we need to address what lies between us, or rather, what doesn't lie between us." The gallery fell silent except for the distant sounds of palace life continuing beyond its walls. Marcus recognized this as a pivotal moment, one that could either heal or further fracture the royal household. He remained motionless, understanding that his duty now extended to protecting not just their physical safety, but the privacy of this crucial conversation. Alexander's composure began to crumble again as he faced his wife directly. The weight of his conflicted emotions, grief for Alara, guilt toward Isabella, and the crushing responsibility of leadership, seemed to overwhelm him completely. Marcus had never seen his king so utterly human, so stripped of the regal bearing that usually defined him. "I've tried to be the husband you deserve," Alexander said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I fear I've only succeeded in making us both miserable with my inability to let go of the past." Isabella's response would set the tone for everything that followed, and Marcus found himself silently praying that wisdom would guide her words. The kingdom's future hung in the balance of this deeply personal moment, and he understood that sometimes the fate of nations rested not on battlefields or in council chambers, but in the honest exchanges between two wounded hearts, seeking understanding in the shadows of memory. Isabella's response came not in words but in action. She closed the remaining distance between them, and for the first time in their 3-year marriage, touched her husband's face with genuine tenderness rather than formal affection. The gesture was so unexpected that Alexander's carefully constructed walls finally crumbled completely. "Alexander," she said, using his given name instead of any royal title, "I need you to listen to me without the weight of the crown between us. Can you do that?" Marcus watched as the king nodded mutely, his eyes never leaving Isabella's face. There was something different about the queen since her return from the Northern Territories. A new confidence, perhaps, or simply the resolution of someone who had made a difficult decision during her time away. "I've known about Ellora's place in your heart from the beginning," Isabella continued, her voice steady despite the tears still glistening in her eyes. "I accepted our marriage understanding that I would never be your first love, only hoping that perhaps, in time, I might become your last." The honesty in her words seemed to pierce Alexander more deeply than any accusation could have. Marcus saw the king's shoulders shake as he absorbed the full impact of his wife's patient suffering. For 3 years, Isabella had endured the cold formality of their union, knowing that her husband's heart resided in a tomb rather than in their shared chambers. "But what I've realized during my time away," Isabella said, taking Alexander's hands in hers, "is that we've both been prisoners. You to your grief, and me to my hope that grief would eventually fade." We've been so focused on what we cannot give each other that we've ignored what we might be able to build together. Alexander's response was barely audible. How can I ask you to accept half a heart when you deserve so much more? Because, Isabella replied, with a sad smile, half of a good man's heart, freely given, is worth more than the whole heart of a man who feels nothing. And despite everything, I know you care for me, Alexander. Perhaps not as you loved Alara, but in your own way, with whatever part of yourself remains available. Marcus found himself deeply moved by the Queen's grace and wisdom. He had always respected Isabella's intelligence and diplomatic skills, but witnessing her navigate this emotional minefield with such compassion revealed depths he hadn't previously recognized. She wasn't demanding that Alexander forget his first love. Instead, she was proposing they find a way forward that honored both their needs. "I've been thinking about Alara," Isabella continued, glancing toward the portrait that had sparked this confrontation. "Not with jealousy, but with genuine curiosity about the woman who earned such devotion. From everything I've learned about her, she was kind, wise, and deeply committed to the welfare of our people. Is that correct?" Alexander managed a weak smile through his tears. "She had the most generous spirit I've ever known. She believed that love wasn't a finite resource, that caring for one person didn't diminish your capacity to care for others. Then don't you think she would want you to be happy? Don't you think she would want our marriage to bring you some measure of peace rather than additional torment?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything Alexander had believed about honoring Alara's memory. Marcus watched as the king wrestled with concepts he had perhaps never allowed himself to consider fully. Could loving someone new be an act of loyalty rather than betrayal? Could moving forward honor the past instead of abandoning it? "I've been so afraid of dishonoring her memory," Alexander admitted, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "I thought that if I allowed myself to care deeply for you, it would somehow diminish what Alara and I shared. But love isn't a competition between the living and the dead," Isabella said gently. "And I'm not asking you to love me as you loved her. I'm asking if we might find our own way to care for each other. Honestly, without pretense, acknowledging our limitations while celebrating our possibilities." Marcus realized he was witnessing something extraordinary, a conversation that could redefine not just a marriage, but an entire approach to love and loss. Isabella wasn't demanding that Alexander choose between his past and his present. She was suggesting they could coexist in a new framework of understanding. "During my time in the Northern Territories," Isabella continued, "I met an elderly duchess whose husband had died after 40 years of marriage. She later remarried, and when I asked her how she could open her heart again after such loss, her answer surprised me. She said that loving her second husband didn't erase her first love. It proved that her heart was capable of expansion rather than replacement." Alexander was listening intently now, his grief temporarily set aside as he considered this new perspective. Marcus had seen many royal negotiations over the years, but none as delicate or consequential as this intimate diplomacy between husband and wife. "What are you proposing?" Alexander asked, and Marcus heard hope creeping into the king's voice for the first time in years. "I'm proposing that we start over," Isabella replied. "Not as strangers, but as two people who understand each other's burdens and limitations. I'm proposing that we build a partnership based on honesty rather than obligation, friendship rather than duty, and whatever form of love we can genuinely offer each other." The transformation in Alexander's posture was visible to Marcus even from his concealed position. The king was straightening, his natural dignity reasserting itself as he considered Isabella's proposal. But this wasn't the rigid formality that usually characterized his bearing. It was the purposeful stance of a man rediscovering direction. "You would be willing to share your husband's heart with a ghost?" Alexander asked, the question carrying both hope and disbelief. "I would be willing to share my husband's heart with his history," Isabella corrected, "because that history made you the man I chose to build a future with, even in an arranged marriage. Your capacity for deep love isn't a flaw, Alexander. It's what makes you worthy of being loved in return." Marcus watched as Alexander took Isabella's hands more firmly, and for the first time since the conversation began, the king's tears seemed to carry relief rather than only anguish. The portrait of Queen Alara seemed to preside over this moment like a benevolent spirit, her painted smile appearing almost approving in the morning light that streamed through the gallery's tall windows. "I need you to know," Alexander said, his voice growing stronger, "that my inability to move forward hasn't been about you, Isabella. You've been everything a king could ask for in a queen. Intelligent, gracious, dedicated to our people. My failure to appreciate you properly has been about my own fears, not your worthiness." "I know," Isabella replied simply, "just as I need you to know that my patience hasn't been entirely selfless. I've seen glimpses of the man you are beneath the grief, and I believe that man is worth waiting for." The honesty between them was creating something Marcus had never witnessed in the royal household. Genuine intimacy. Not the passionate romance Alexander had shared with Alara, but a deeper understanding that might prove equally valuable in its own way. "How do we begin?" Alexander asked, and Marcus heard the vulnerability in the question. Here was a man who could command armies and negotiate treaties, asking his wife for guidance in matters of the heart. "We begin with truth," Isabella said. "We stop pretending that duty is enough to sustain a marriage. We start acknowledging what we feel, or don't feel, without shame, and we give ourselves permission to grow into whatever we might become together, rather than trying to force ourselves into roles that don't fit." Alexander nodded slowly, his gaze moving between his wife's face and Alara's portrait. Marcus could see the internal struggle as the king attempted to reconcile his past love with his present opportunity. The moment stretched like a held breath, pregnant with possibility and fear in equal measure. Then Alexander did something that surprised even Marcus. He laughed, not with humor, but with the relief of a man finally understanding a complex problem that had puzzled him for years. "Alara used to say that the heart was like a garden," Alexander said, his voice growing warm with memory. "She believed that you could plant new flowers without destroying the ones already growing. Perhaps it's time I stopped viewing love as a finite resource and started seeing it as something that could expand rather than replace." Isabella's smile was radiant as she recognized the shift in her husband's thinking. Perhaps Queen Alara was wise about more than just matters of state. She was. Alexander agreed, then took a deep breath before continuing. "Isabella, would you be willing to help me learn how to honor the past while building something new? I cannot promise to love you exactly as I loved Alara, but I can promise to try loving you as you deserve to be loved, honestly and completely, in whatever way my heart proves capable." The transformation Marcus witnessed in that moment would remain with him for the rest of his service. The broken king was still grieving, but he was no longer drowning in that grief. The patient queen was still hoping, but her hope now had a foundation in mutual understanding rather than wishful thinking. As the royal couple embraced, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, Marcus realized that he had witnessed the beginning of something unprecedented in the royal household. Not a fairy tale romance, but something perhaps more valuable. A mature partnership built on honesty, respect, and the courage to love imperfectly in an imperfect world. The weeks following that morning in the portrait gallery brought changes to Ravenscroft Palace that even the most observant servants couldn't quite understand, but everyone could feel. Marcus watched as King Alexander and Queen Isabella began what could only be described as a careful courtship of their existing marriage, learning each other anew with the benefit of complete honesty. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden. There were no grand romantic gestures or public declarations of renewed love. Instead, Marcus observed a series of small, meaningful shifts that collectively created something entirely new within the royal household. The king began joining Isabella for her morning walks in the palace gardens, their conversations growing longer and more animated with each passing day. The queen started attending Alexander's military briefings, not as a silent observer, but as an engaged participant, whose insights often proved valuable. Most significantly, Alexander had commissioned a new portrait, one that would hang beside Alara's in the gallery. But this painting wouldn't be of Isabella alone. It would depict both monarchs together, representing their partnership and their kingdom's future. The decision had shocked the court, but Marcus understood its deeper meaning. Alexander wasn't replacing his past. He was finally allowing his present to claim its rightful place in his life. However, not everyone in the kingdom was prepared to accept these changes with grace. The court had grown comfortable with the predictable distance between their monarchs, and some nobles had even benefited from playing the king and queen against each other in subtle political maneuvering. Now, faced with a united royal front, certain factions began to express their displeasure through whispered criticism and passive resistance. Lord Chancellor Edmund Blackthorne had been particularly vocal in his concerns, though he was careful to frame his objections in terms of royal protocol and tradition. Marcus had overheard several conversations where Blackthorne questioned whether it was appropriate for the king to be abandoning his grief so suddenly, and whether the queen's influence was becoming too pronounced in matters of state. The real test of the royal couple's newfound partnership came during a crucial council meeting regarding trade negotiations with the Eastern kingdoms. For years, these negotiations had stalled due to competing interests among the noble houses, with each faction pushing for agreements that favored their particular holdings. Alexander had traditionally handled such matters with formal consultation from Isabella, but their separate approaches had often led to conflicting signals being sent to foreign diplomats. This time, however, the king and queen presented a unified position that had clearly been developed through extensive private discussion. Their proposal was innovative and fair, addressing the concerns of multiple noble houses while prioritizing the kingdom's overall interests. But Lord Blackthorne and his allies weren't prepared to accept this new dynamic without a fight. "Your Majesty," Blackthorne said, his tone respectfully formal but carrying an undercurrent of challenge, "while we all appreciate Her Majesty's intelligence and diplomatic experience, some of us are concerned about the precedent being set. The Eastern kingdoms may view our sudden change in negotiating style as a sign of instability or uncertainty in our leadership." Marcus, positioned as always near the council chamber's entrance, saw Isabella's slight stiffening at the implied criticism. But before she could respond, Alexander stepped forward with quiet authority. "Lord Blackthorne," the king said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute sovereignty, "I believe you misunderstand the nature of what you're witnessing. This isn't a change in our kingdom's stability. It's a demonstration of our strength. A monarchy that can evolve and adapt while maintaining its core principles is far more robust than one that relies on rigid tradition alone." The response surprised many council members, including Marcus. The old Alexander would likely have withdrawn into formal protocol when challenged, avoiding confrontation in favor of maintaining surface harmony. This Alexander was clearly prepared to defend not just his policy decisions, but the partnership with his wife that had informed those decisions. Furthermore, Alexander continued, his gaze moving deliberately around the council table, "I want to make something absolutely clear to all present. Queen Isabella is not merely an advisor to the crown. She is a partner in its responsibilities. Any disrespect shown to her judgment or authority will be considered disrespect to the crown itself." The declaration sent ripples of shock through the assembled nobles. Traditional royal protocol had always maintained clear hierarchies, with the king's authority supreme and the queen's role largely ceremonial in matters of governance. By elevating Isabella to genuine partnership, Alexander was fundamentally altering the power structure that had governed the kingdom for generations. Isabella's response to her husband's declaration was equally significant. Rather than appearing pleased by the elevation of her status, she addressed the council with the measured wisdom of someone who understood the delicate balance required for effective leadership. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying quiet authority, "I want to assure you that this partnership serves the kingdom's interests, not personal ones. His Majesty and I have different strengths and perspectives, and we believe that combining them produces better outcomes than either of us could achieve independently. This isn't about changing traditions for the sake of change. It's about utilizing all available resources to serve our people effectively." Marcus watched as several council members exchanged glances, clearly reassessing their understanding of the royal dynamic. Isabella's diplomatic skill was well known, but her willingness to take responsibility for controversial decisions alongside her husband demonstrated a new level of political maturity and courage. Lord Blackthorne, however, wasn't ready to concede defeat. "Your Majesties," he said, his tone growing more pointed, "while we all respect your intentions, some of us remember the difficulties that arose when personal feelings influenced royal policy in the past." The reference to Alara was subtle but unmistakable, and Marcus felt the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Blackthorn was essentially suggesting that Alexander's emotional attachments made him unsuitable for purely rational governance, a criticism that struck at the heart of the king's deepest insecurities. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Marcus had witnessed many political confrontations during his years of service, but few had carried such personal stakes. How Alexander responded to this challenge would determine not just the outcome of the current policy debate, but the future of his marriage and his effectiveness as a monarch. When Alexander finally spoke, his voice carried a gravity that commanded absolute attention. "Lord Blackthorn," he said, rising from his chair to emphasize the formality of his response, "I believe you're laboring under a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of leadership." The king moved around the council table as he spoke, his bearing regal but not intimidating. "You seem to believe that effective governance requires the suppression of human emotion and personal connection, but I would argue that the opposite is true. A ruler who cannot form deep attachments, who cannot understand love and loss and hope and fear, cannot truly serve people who experience all these things daily." Marcus was struck by the transformation in Alexander's presence. The broken man who had wept before Alara's portrait was still there, but he had been integrated with the wise king who had learned from his pain rather than being destroyed by it. "Queen Alara's death taught me about the fragility of happiness and the importance of cherishing what we have while we have it," Alexander continued. "Queen Isabella's patience has taught me about the possibility of renewal and the strength that comes from honest partnership. Both experiences have made me a better ruler because they've made me a more complete human being." The king returned to his position beside Isabella, and Marcus noted how naturally they stood together, not as formal allies but as genuine partners. "The trade agreement we've proposed isn't the product of emotional decision-making," Alexander said firmly. "It's the result of careful analysis enhanced by two different perspectives working in harmony. And I would suggest that future policy debates focus on the merits of our proposals rather than the character of our partnership." Lord Blackthorn's expression revealed his recognition that his challenge had not only failed, but had actually strengthened the very dynamic he had sought to undermine. By forcing Alexander to defend his marriage publicly, Blackthorn had inadvertently given the king an opportunity to demonstrate the confidence and unity that their partnership had created. Isabella then did something that surprised everyone, including Marcus. She reached for her husband's hand, not a gesture of romantic affection, but a simple sign of solidarity that spoke volumes about their mutual support. The act was so natural and unself-conscious that it transformed the political atmosphere in the room, making further challenges seem petty rather than principled. "If there are no further objections to the substance of our proposal," Isabella said calmly, "perhaps we could move forward with the practical details of implementation." The council meeting proceeded with remarkable efficiency from that point forward. The trade agreement was approved with minimal additional discussion, and Marcus noticed that subsequent policy debates carried a different tone, more focused on practical outcomes and less concerned with political maneuvering. As the nobles filed out of the council chamber, Marcus observed several private conversations taking place. Some council members appeared troubled by the new dynamic, while others seemed genuinely impressed by the effectiveness of the royal partnership. The kingdom's future direction had been established not through dramatic confrontation, but through quiet demonstration of competent, unified leadership. But Marcus knew that Lord Blackthorn and his allies wouldn't abandon their resistance easily. The challenge had been defeated, but not eliminated, and the royal couple would need to remain vigilant against future attempts to undermine their partnership. The true test of their renewed marriage wouldn't come from external political pressures alone, but from their ability to maintain their hard-won understanding under the constant scrutiny and stress of royal life. As Alexander and Isabella left the council chamber together, Marcus noted the easy conversation between them and the natural coordination of their movements. They had successfully navigated their first major political challenge as true partners, but the road ahead would require continued growth and adaptation. The broken crown was being reforged, but the process would demand ongoing commitment from both monarchs to the difficult work of building something new from the pieces of what had been lost. 6 months after that pivotal morning in the portrait gallery, Marcus found himself once again conducting his evening security rounds through the palace corridors. The familiar routine had taken on new meaning as he witnessed the ongoing transformation of the royal household. The changes that had begun with a moment of vulnerability had evolved into something far more substantial, a genuine renewal that touched every aspect of palace life. The portrait gallery had become a symbol of this transformation. The new painting of King Alexander and Queen Isabella had been completed and now hung beside Queen Alara's portrait, creating a visual representation of how past and present could coexist harmoniously. But more significantly, the gallery had become a place where the royal couple would often walk together in the evenings, their conversations reflecting the deep partnership they had built through months of patient effort. On this particular evening, Marcus encountered something that would have been unimaginable during his earlier years of service. King Alexander and Queen Isabella were in the gallery, but they weren't alone. Princess Catherine, Alexander's 8-year-old daughter from his marriage to Ilara, was with them, and the three were engaged in animated discussion about the portraits and their family history. Marcus paused in his rounds, not to eavesdrop, but because the scene before him represented such a profound departure from the careful distance that had previously characterized family interactions in the palace. Catherine had struggled significantly after her mother's death, and her relationship with Isabella had been polite but guarded. Alexander, consumed by his own grief, had often seemed uncertain about how to balance his roles as father and king. "Tell me again about Mama's favorite flower," Catherine was saying to Isabella, her young voice filled with genuine curiosity rather than the defensive tone she had previously used when discussing her deceased mother. Isabella knelt to the child's level, her response gentle but confident. "Your mother loved white roses because she said they represented new beginnings and pure intentions. She had them planted throughout the palace gardens so that their beauty would remind everyone who saw them about the possibility of hope." Marcus was struck by how naturally Isabella had learned to speak about Ilara, not as a rival or an uncomfortable subject to be avoided, but as an important part of their family's history. This integration hadn't happened overnight. It had required months of careful conversations and patient relationship building. "And that's why Papa included white roses in our new portrait," Catherine observed, pointing to the painting that depicted Alexander and Isabella in the garden setting that had become symbolic of their renewed partnership. "Exactly," Alexander confirmed, his voice carrying warmth that Marcus rarely heard during official duties. "We wanted to show that love doesn't end when someone dies. It becomes part of the foundation for everything we build afterward." The conversation continued as the royal family moved through the gallery, examining each portrait and discussing the stories behind them. Marcus realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. A blended family finding its own way to honor the past while embracing the future. Catherine's acceptance of Isabella hadn't erased her love for her deceased mother. Instead, it had given her an additional source of guidance and affection. But the evening held one more surprise that would demonstrate just how far the royal transformation had progressed. As the family approached Queen Alara's portrait, Catherine did something completely unexpected. She asked Isabella to tell her a story about her mother that she hadn't heard before. "I know you never met Mama," Catherine said with the directness that only children possess. "But Papa has told you lots of stories about her. Is there one that helps you understand why he loved her so much?" The question could have been a minefield, potentially reopening wounds or creating uncomfortable comparisons. But Isabella's response revealed the depth of emotional maturity she had developed during their journey toward understanding. "There's a story your father told me about your mother's kindness to a servant girl who had made a serious mistake," Isabella said thoughtfully. "Instead of having the girl punished, your mother spent time teaching her the correct way to perform her duties. When other nobles criticized her for being too lenient, your mother said that true nobility meant lifting others up rather than putting them down." Catherine listened intently, her eyes moving between Isabella's face and her mother's portrait. "That sounds like Mama," she said finally. "She always said that being royal meant taking care of everyone, not just the important people." "That's exactly right," Isabella agreed. "And that's one of the qualities your father loved most about her, her belief that leadership was about service rather than privilege." Marcus watched Alexander's face during this exchange and saw something remarkable. Complete peace. The king who had once been tortured by the gap between his past and present was now witnessing their harmonious integration in the most important area of his life, his relationship with his daughter. "Is that why you and Papa work together so much now?" Catherine asked, her question reflecting the perceptiveness that children often display about adult relationships.
Partly, Isabella replied honestly. But also because we've learned that we're both better at helping people when we combine our different strengths.
Your father understands the responsibilities of leadership because he was born to them. I understand them because I chose to accept them. Together, we can serve the kingdom more completely than either of us could alone. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lord Chancellor Blackthorne, who approached with his usual formal bearing, but with something different in his demeanor. Over the months since the council confrontation, Blackthorne had gradually acknowledged the effectiveness of the royal partnership, though his acceptance had been grudging rather than enthusiastic. "Your Majesties," Blackthorne said with appropriate bows, "I apologize for the interruption, but we've received word from the Eastern Kingdoms regarding the trade agreement. They've not only accepted our proposal, but have requested to use it as a model for their negotiations with other nations." The news represented a significant diplomatic victory, validating the approach that Alexander and Isabella had developed together. But Marcus was most interested in how they received the information, not as individual vindication, but as shared success. "Excellent news," Alexander replied. "Please arrange a briefing for tomorrow morning so we can discuss the implications and next steps." "Of course, Your Majesty," Blackthorne responded, then did something unprecedented. He addressed Isabella directly with equal formality. "Your Majesty, the foreign ambassadors specifically mentioned your insights regarding regional economic patterns. They were impressed by the depth of analysis in the proposal." Isabella accepted the recognition graciously, but immediately redirected attention to their collaborative approach. The analysis was most effective because it combined traditional diplomatic protocols with practical economic understanding. Success like this is only possible when different perspectives work together rather than competing. As Blackthorne departed to arrange the requested briefing, Marcus reflected on the complete transformation he had witnessed in the royal household's dynamics. The Lord Chancellor, who had once questioned the royal partnership, was now actively facilitating its success. The family that had been fractured by grief and formality was now united in purpose and affection. The kingdom that had struggled with inconsistent leadership was now benefiting from coordinated, thoughtful governance. But perhaps the most significant change was visible in King Alexander himself. The broken man who had wept before a portrait had become a leader who understood that strength could emerge from vulnerability, that admitting limitations could lead to greater effectiveness, and that honoring the past didn't require sacrificing the future. As the royal family prepared to leave the gallery, Catherine made one final observation that seemed to capture the essence of their journey. "I think Mama would be happy about how things turned out. She always wanted Papa to be happy, and she would have liked Isabella because Isabella makes Papa smile again." The simple wisdom of a child's perspective provided the perfect conclusion to months of complex emotional work. Alexander and Isabella had found their way to a relationship that honored all their commitments, to each other, to Catherine, to Elara's memory, and to their kingdom's needs. Marcus completed his evening rounds with a sense of satisfaction that went beyond mere security concerns. He had witnessed a royal household discover that healing didn't require forgetting, that moving forward didn't mean abandoning what came before, and that sometimes the strongest foundations were built from pieces that had been broken and carefully reassembled. The portrait gallery that had once been a shrine to loss had become a celebration of continuity and growth. The king, who had been paralyzed by grief, had rediscovered his capacity for effective leadership. The queen, who had endured loneliness with grace, had found her place in a complex but loving family. And a young princess had learned that love could expand, rather than diminish, when new people entered her world. As Marcus settled into his night watch, he reflected on the profound truth he had learned through observing the royal transformation. Sometimes the most important victories weren't won through conquest or negotiation, but through the patient work of understanding, forgiveness, and the courage to build something new without destroying what had been valuable about the past. The crown that had been broken by tragedy had been reforged through wisdom, and the kingdom was stronger for having witnessed the process.